Hi, this is Cathleen de Ontiveros, and today we're going to learn how to draft the pattern and how to sew this cute mermaid tail beach bag. This is a lined bag. We're going to make the handles, and we're going to learn how to do basic machine quilting of the fins on the tail. The things that we're going to need to get started are going to be two fabrics. It can be the same fabric, but I have two fabrics, one for the outside of the mermaid bag. We're going to need fabric to make the lining of the bag. We're going to need some very thin batting. The thickness is up to you. I'm choosing this very, very thin batting. We're going to need scissors, paper scissors, and fabric scissors. We're going to need some copy paper that we're going to use to make our patterns with. Some Scotch tape, a tape measure. I like to use the seam gauge ruler. You're going to need a ruler. I'm going to be using these rulers from Joann's that I picked up. Remember to use your coupons. And you're going to need a pen or a pencil to mark your patterns with. Okay, let's get started. This is what our finished mermaid tail pattern is going to look like. This is very simple. The same method that I use for how to make my pencil skirt is how I make this pattern. We're going to start with our pattern paper. I'm using two pieces of copy paper that I have taped together. I'm going to begin at the top of my piece of paper by measuring 5 inches in from the middle line. This will be the middle of our pattern. Line up my tape at the top, and I'm going to make my first guide mark right there at 5 inches. Now I'm going to come down 4 1/4 inches from the top of my paper. 4 1/4 inches. This is where the hip curve is going to be for our mermaid tail. Now I'm going to turn my tape measure the other direction, and I'm going to line up at the 6 1/4 inch mark at the middle of our paper, right here at the edge, coming along the same line, and I'm going to make another guide mark at the very end, marking where that 6 1/4 inches is at. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to just draw that in nice and solid to make it a little bit easier for us to see the outline as it's taking place. The next measurement is going to be from the top of the paper again, coming down 7 1/4 inches. 7 1/4 inches, I'm going to make a little dot there. Again, turn my measuring tape, put it at the 6 inch mark on the edge of my paper, lining it up with that little guide dot that I made. Make another mark here at the end. I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to draw that again in as a solid line. The next measurement is going to be from the top of the paper 12 inches down. Place the measuring tape at the top of my paper, come down 12 inches, make a little guide mark, turn the measuring tape, and this time at 4 1/4 inches, keeping it flush at that little mark. I'm going to make my other guide mark, bring my ruler in, and draw my solid line. The next mark that we're going to make is going to be measuring 19 1/2 inches down from the top of our paper. (19 1/2 inches), and I'm going to make a little mark. Now coming in from the center of our paper at 1 1/4 inch, I'm going to make another mark. I'm just going to draw that line in. That is going to be the end of our tail. Now we're going to start connecting these dots together. You can either use a hip curve ruler and simply line it up to the outside of where our lines are at and draw this in, connecting all of the dots, moving it as you go. Or you can simply do it freehand. Slowly sketching in. And the last part, you could even take your straight ruler, lining it up at that last guide point and the point of your tail, and just draw that in as a straight line. This is your mermaid pattern tail for the main part of the mermaid tail. Now we're going to write in some little arrows right here to remind us when we're cutting this that this will be cut on the fold. This symbol, when you see it on a commercial pattern, means to cut on the fold of the fabric. I'm going to write cut 2 of my main fabric and cut 2 of the lining. The next step will be to make the fin of our mermaid. Will look like this when we're through. And these are our measurements. We're going to start by laying down a folded piece of copy paper that I have folded lengthwise. This will be the center fold of our fabric, our pattern. This one has less measurements to make, so it's going to be faster. At the top, we're going to measure 2.5 inches in. So at the 2.5 inch mark, we're going to make a little dot. We're going to then measure 3.5 inches down. Make another mark right there, 3.5 inches. Flip our measuring tape at 3 3/8 of an inch. Right there, we're going to line that mark up at the edge of our paper. And we're going to make a little guide dot. Now we're going to come down from the top of our paper 9 inches, and this is where the pointy part of the fin will be. Right there, and make our guide dot. Again, we're going to want to draw a curve connecting these dots. Coming all the way down. And this fin can be any shape that you want. You can use also a plate to make the curve, or you can just freehand it like I did. When you cut it out, you're going to have a pattern piece that looks like this. Now we also need to make a pattern for the batting that's going to go inside of the fin of our mermaid. You can simply take the pattern that you made for the fin, cut out your batting, and then trim off a little bit to make this smaller, because we don't want it to be the exact same size as the fin. This needs to fit into the fin after we have sewn it. Or you can take your pattern that you made for your mermaid fin, and you can take your little seam ruler and you can just mark in 1/2 inch all the way around and then cut it, and that can be your pattern. So you can actually make 2 patterns, one for the fin and 1 1/2 inch smaller all the way around for your batting that's going to go into the fin. We're going to now connect the 2 pattern pieces, the fin to the main part of the mermaid tail. By doing this, I'm simply going to use a little bit of tape, and I'm going to decide where I think I want the placement of that fin to be. I'm going to overlap it by about 1/4 inch or so, and I've rounded in this pointy part of the tail. I've given that a nice little round indentation. You can see this better when I open up my finished pattern. Because it's going to look better with a curve right here rather than a point. So I'm curving in the pointy part of the tail just a little bit, and you can add a slight curve right here where the fin meets the mermaid body as well if you like. I'm going to take my main pattern. I'm going to decide the placement of where I want that fin to join. I'm going to overlap it just a little bit, and I'm going to tape it in place. Now this will go on the center fold of our fabric, and we will cut 2 of this piece. When we open it up, we'll have the full complete mermaid. When you go to cut the lining piece, you do not want the tail on the lining piece. So what I do is I just fold the tail in, and this goes on the center fold of my fabric, and I will cut the lining piece without the fin attached. And our lining piece, let me show you what that looks like. So this is what our lining piece looks like because we don't have the fin attached. The outer piece will have the fin attached, and it's going to look like this. So you're going to want to cut out both of your pieces for your outer mermaid tail with the fin. You're going to want to cut 2 pieces for the lining, and you're going to want to cut 2 pieces of batting that goes inside of the fin. Once you have that all cut together, then we can begin the construction of our mermaid bag. I've laid my pattern down onto my paper with the fold of the fabric being right here where the center of my pattern is at, and I like to use butter knives to weigh down my pattern. I don't like to pin anything. Because this is a bag and not a fashion garment that I'm sewing, I'm going to take the pen and I'm going to draw all the way around my pattern, giving me a cutting line. Then I'm going to pull my pattern off, put it to one side. I'm going to carefully put down, either pin this with a couple of pins, or again put down my butter knives to weigh the pattern down to keep it from moving too much as I cut. And with my fabric scissors, I'm going to cut along this line that I have drawn onto my fabric. I'm going to cut 2 of the main body, and then I'll show you how I cut my lining. I'm going to lay my fabric down where I have it already folded. I'm going to lay my pattern on top, very carefully matching up the edge of my pattern piece with the fold of the fabric. And once I have that nicely lined up, I'm simply going to fold over the fin part of the tail for the pattern here, and I'm going to weight that down or pin it in place, and then I can cut out the lining of my mermaid bag without making a separate pattern. If you're not comfortable doing it this method, then just go ahead and make a separate pattern piece for your lining, or cut your lining out before you tape the fin onto your main pattern piece. We have one more piece of fabric to cut now, and that will be the part making up our straps for our tote bag. Now these you can make as short as you want or as long as you want. You can make them shoulder straps, or you can make them short to be a little handle that you carry with your hand or sling over the curve of your arm. That is completely up to you. For my straps, I have measured out 2 pieces of fabric left over from my scraps, or it can be a coordinating fabric, or it can match your lining. So I have cut 2 pieces of fabric, and my fabric measures 3 inches wide by 40 inches long. So if you double up your fabric, the easiest way to do this is double your fabric, place your clear 3-inch ruler over the top, trace down it, and measure at 20 inches with your fabric doubled. When you open it up, that will give you your fabric strip measuring 3 inches wide by 40 inches long. We're going to then double the fabric over and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and this will give us a really narrow strip. For my sample bag, it had a wider strap, and for that I cut 4 inches of the fabric at 3 inches wide by 40 inches long. So if you're going to do the narrow straps like I'm doing on this bag, it will be 2 pieces of fabric measuring 3 inches wide by 40 inches long. If you want the wider straps, you're going to need 4 pieces of this fabric that measure 3 inches wide by 40 inches long. If you have any questions on that, go ahead and message me so I can try and clarify it a little bit more. Now that we're ready to sew our bag together, I'm coming to my sewing machine and I'm making sure that my needle stitch selection is for the middle. I don't want my needle to the left, I don't want it to the right, I want it in the middle. I'm going to make sure that my stitch length is at a 3 or a 3.5. With my machine, I like it at a 3.5. I'm going to make sure that my stitch width is at a straight stitch. I don't want it on a zigzag. So I always check these things before I start sewing. Now I have pinned my mermaid bag all the way around, leaving it open at the top where it would be the waist. And I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have the fabric right at the edge of my presser foot. That's the 1/4 inch on my machine. And I'm going to take a few stitches forward and take a couple stitches back, and this will secure my thread. And then I'll sew all the way around, removing my pins as I go. And when I get to the other side, the top of the waist, I'm going to stop. I'm going to do a couple back stitches again to secure my thread, and we'll move on to the next part. Now once we finish sewing, we have to come in, and anywhere that there is a curve, we're going to clip these seams. That will make it lay nice and flat after the bag has been turned right side out. So I'm going to come, and I'm very, very careful that I do not cut through my seam that I just sewed. Do not cut through those stitches. Just a little triangle snip all along where this curve is at, and this will make it lay flatter. Again, very, very careful. Do not cut through your stitches. If you cut through your stitches, it will not be the end of the world. In this particular case, with this bag, you can just sew it again and make a wider seam allowance to cover the part where you cut through the stitches. Just take your time, go all the way around, and anywhere that there's a curve, like here in the tail, we'll have to make a clip there, and around the curve of the fins, we'll have to make clips there. So all the way around, wherever there's a curve at, just make these little, very, very careful clips, and this will help your fabric to lay the way that it needs to lay, nice and flat without being puckered when we turn it right side out. Once you've clipped the corners and you have turned the mermaid tail, you're going to want to take an iron and give it a really good pressing. This is the part that we're going to be machine quilting, the fins, so we really want to make sure that we don't have any of the puckers here where the curves are at, that this is all nicely pressed. And it takes a little bit of doing. Sometimes you might want to give it a squirt with a squirt bottle or use your steam iron to make sure that you get that nice and pressed. We want a really, really good pressing with this before we begin our quilting. After we finish pressing the mermaid tail, I'm going to take my 2 pieces of batting that I've cut, and I'm going to insert them inside of the bag and into the fin, and then we're going to pin it in place. We just open up the bag, and I kind of double this over to place it into the fin. I'm just going to work it down in there. And then I want to open it up flat, and I might need to use my scissors or a butter knife or something flat to be able to help move it into place very carefully so we don't push through the seams. I'm going to want the point of that fin batting down into the point of the fin. And so I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to work this into place. I'm going to take my point of my scissors and help me get that in there. And once I have it worked into place, I'm going to pin it. It's not laying quite flat yet. And sometimes it just takes a few minutes, and you've got to have patience when you're working with projects like this. So once I have it all into place, I'm going to take my pins and I'm just going to pin that batting all the way around the edge because we're going to start machine quilting that. So we're going to put the batting into both of the fins. We're going to pin it around the edges so that it's held in place. and then we're going to take it to our sewing machines. Okay, we're going to take our mermaid tail to the sewing machine, and we're going to do some very basic machine quilting on the fin part. And I'm going to start off with mine at the 5/8 of an inch mark. Now you can use sparkly threads in this, you can use decorative stitches, you could choose to hand sew this, use embroidery floss, you can add beads. You can do anything that you want to this. This is your art project. Here's a mermaid tail that I'm making for a doll. And this is heavily sequined and hand beaded. I'm not going to go to that extent on my mermaid beach bags, but I will add a little bit of bling to them before I'm finished. So we have it at straight stitch on my machine at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to do a back stitch, a couple stitches forward, couple stitches back to secure my thread, and at 5/8 of an inch I'm going to go all the way down, and when we get to the tip I will show you how we rotate that again. Try to take out the pins before you sew over them. Go really slow around the curves, manipulating that. Now as we come to the point here, I'll try to gauge where the 5/8 of an inch is at before I stop. Thinking maybe right there. So my needle is down, lift up the presser foot, and I'm going to rotate my fabric around, leaving it in, and it's almost at the 5/8. It's close enough. I'm going to call it good. Lower the presser foot, the needle is still down, and now I continue sewing. Very slow around those corners. And when I come just to where that curve starts to happen again, I'm going to come up and I'm going to stop and I'm going to back stitch again, forward stitch, pull it off, clip my threads. I try to clip my threads as I work so I don't have a huge mess to clean up when my project is finished. Now I'm going to come back, turning my fin right back to where I started from. Make sure I clip those starting threads. And this time I'm going to put the thread that I just sewed is going to be at the outside of my presser foot. So the thread that I just stitched is going to become my guide sewing. And if you want to take a fabric marker or a piece of chalk and you want to draw your guidelines on here before you start, that's completely fine. I'm just doing this by sight, and I know that I'm going to use my guide stitches to make my next line of stitching. I'm going to do 3 rows of my top stitching for my little quilted part here on the fin. I'm going to turn it over. I used contrasting thread on the bobbin so you can see the white stitches here. You can add as many rows. You can do 2 rows and then leave it at that, or you can continue in. You could do 5, 6 rows. That's up to you. You can also choose the stitch that you want, put a decorative stitch in. That is up to you as well. This adds a little bit of stability, gives the fin shape on our beach bag so that it doesn't get all crumpled and lose the shape of an actual fin. I'm going to continue on with this and finish my part of the quilting, and we're going to move on to the lining. Okay, now we have moved on to the lining of our mermaid bag, and I am going to pin it all on the one side, and on the second side I don't want to pin it yet. I'm going to take my tape measure, and 2 inches in from the bottom of the tail I'm going to make a mark. Then I'm going to measure 6 inches and I'm going to make another mark right here where the 6 inches ends. Now this will be my opening to turn my bag, and then I'm going to have to hand stitch it. So then for the remainder of the bag I can pin it, but after I make either some guide marks with an ink pen or I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and I'm just going to sew each of the layers at the 1/4 inch mark to give me some guide threads so that I can see where I'm going to need to turn my fabric under when I'm doing my hand stitching. Because this fabric is black, I'm using a white ink pen. You can use a chalk marker or you can use a fabric marker. I'm just going to make some little marks here so that I remember where I need to turn my fabric under at. The guide stitching is very easy and very useful to do as well. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. I'm going to put some guide stitching in and I'm going to sew all the way around, leaving this area open, the 6 inches, for my turning of my bag. So remember, 1/4 inch seam allowance when we're sewing this lining up. That's going to be at the edge of your presser foot. I've sewn up my lining and I made my guide stitching in white for that 6 inches. This is the part that I left open where we're going to turn the bag. And I'm going to set this to one side, and now I'm going to work on making the straps for my bag. I'm going to fold this in half, right sides together, lengthwise, and I'm going to pin it. When I get to the end, I'm going to take a diaper pin, and I buy these in the baby section. I buy a couple packages at a time. I like to always keep these for putting my elastic and for when I'm turning a long tube of fabric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, right about where the crease would be, I'm going to insert the diaper pin into the fabric, go in, come back up, and I'm going to close it. Now the nice thing about a diaper safety pin versus a regular safety pin is that this goes through smoothly. It doesn't catch on the fabric and it doesn't come undone while I'm working my elastic or while I'm turning my fabric. So I'm just going to lay that in there, going to continue pinning my fabric right over the top of that, take it to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this at 1/4 inch seam allowance, just like I did the rest of it. So that will be the edge of the presser foot is going to be the edge of my fabric here, and I'm going to do that with a straight stitch. Okay, I have finished sewing up our strap, and this is where the safety pin is at on the inside of the fabric. There you can see the pin. And I'm going to take my fabric and I'm just going to gently push the pin upwards. The fabric's going to be gathering on this side, and I'm going to pull that down over the pin as I go. And I'm just going to continue pushing the pin up. See how the fabric gathers? Every once in a while I'm just going to grab that fabric and I'm going to pull it down over that pin. And you want to be careful, do this very gently so that you don't tear your fabric, because the pin is in there in the fabric. And we're just going to continue manipulating that pin upwards through that tube of fabric. And because this is a narrow tube, it's going to be a little bit more difficult than if we were using a wider piece of fabric. But we're just going to keep working our way up. Gently pull that fabric down. Push the pin upwards through our tube of fabric. We get a little bit gathered on it, we're going to pull it down, being gentle, work from both sides. And this is going to take a few minutes. You need to have patience when you're doing this. This is not something to do if you're in a hurry, because when you're in a hurry and you're trying to sew, you usually end up making mistakes, and you either have to remove your stitches, resew what you've sewn, or you're going to make a mistake with your fabric that cannot be fixed. So here we're coming to the end, and I've got my fabric. I'm going to take my pin, I'm going to open it up, very carefully pull it out at this point, and then continue pulling my fabric all the way through. Okay, now I can take this to the ironing board and I can press it because we're going to top stitch this. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to do the same thing I did to my mermaid tail. I'm just going to give it a really good press with the iron and make it nice and flat, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, just so I can show you how I'm pressing open this strap. The narrower strap is a little bit more difficult, and it kind of rolls up like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to press it so that the seam is going to be in the middle of the strap. So when I finish, it's going to be all nice and flat, just like that, and then I can top stitch it, and there's the seam running right down the middle. So with my fingers, I'm just going to roll it until I get that seam right in the middle, and it's pretty much even. And I'm going to give it a squirt with my squirt bottle. I'm going to take my iron, and I'm just going to give it a good press. And I'm going to move right on along this strap of fabric, and I'm just going to roll it into place, keeping that seam right in the middle. Kind of flatten it out with my fingers, give it a spray with the spray bottle, and then take my hot iron and press it. Continue that all the way down. I'm going to turn it over, give a real good press on the other side, make sure there's no wrinkles in either of the sides, and then we can take it and do our top stitching. Okay, now before we go any further with our bag, I want you to take the straps that we have already pressed and we've top stitched, and I want you to pin them onto your bag and then try your bag. Put this onto your shoulder and make sure that the bag is going to be at the right length that you want, because after we've put the lining in, the straps are going to be a lot more difficult to alter. If they're too long, you can always tie them in a knot at the end. It looks cute, and it also serves the purpose of shortening the straps a little bit. So now's the time. Try on the bag, make sure that the strap length is the correct length before we go any further. This is an optional step of top stitching the straps. I prefer to do this so that my straps stay nice and flat, because as I wear the bag, the strap is not going to stay nice and pressed. It's going to crumple up and lose its shape. So I like to put it under the presser foot, again at the 1/4 inch mark, where the fabric is right at the edge of the presser foot, and I'm going to go down all the way the length of this strap. Then I'm going to come onto the other side of the fabric, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put it at the 1/4 inch mark, and I'm going to stitch it all the way down, so it will have 2 rows of stitching holding it in place. Okay, we have all of our pieces sewn and top stitched, and now we're ready to start putting together the actual construction of the final part of our bag. I'm going to take my straps, and it's difficult to tell with this print, but this is the right side and this is the wrong side. This is where I have that seam at, and then I've top stitched it on each side. I'm going to put the wrong side where the seam is at facing me. I'm going to come to the top of my bag, and with my tape measure 1.5 inches in from the outside of the bag, I'm going to place it wrong side up, and I'm going to pin that in place. Then I'm going to come to the other side of my bag, and I'm going to do the same thing. At 1.5 inches in from the very top, I'm going to place that wrong side up, and I'm going to pin that in place, and I'm going to sew this, just the strap, at 5/8 of an inch on my seam allowance on the sewing machine. I'm going to do that on both sides of the bag with my straps, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to place them. Now we're at the exciting part of starting to sew the lining together. We have our straps sewn onto the bag, and I'm going to take the straps and I'm going to fold them down, and I'm going to fold the fins on top just like this, and I'm going to take my bag and I'm going to insert it. Here's my lining, and this is the wrong side out, okay? Wrong side out. I'm going to take my bag, which is right side out, and I'm going to insert it into the opening of this lining right here. And I'm going to bring the top all the way up together to match with the side seams. Okay, put the bag all the way in. I'm going to match my side seams. There's one side seam. So now we have the right sides are together. The wrong side of the lining is out, and the right side of the lining is to the right side of the bag. So I'm going to match my side seams first. I'm going to put a pin there. Going to match the other side seam. Trying to keep all those handle pieces in there. Match the other side seam and put a pin. going to stretch it out, and I'm going to match this up, and I'm going to pin all the way around. At 5/8 of an inch is where we're going to sew this part. We have the main part of the bag attached to the lining. We're bringing it to the sewing machine with the needle position in the center and our thread length again at 3 or 3.5, and we're going to do this with a straight stitch. I'm going to measure out where the 5/8 of an inch is, place my fabric there, lower my needle. Going to remember to pull my fabric where it's nice and straight. I don't want anything puckered up or pleated in there. I'm going to take a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and I'm going to keep this at the 5/8 inch mark all the way around until I have completely sewn the entire lining to the top. We're not going to leave any openings in the top part. We're going to sew it all the way around. Remember to backstitch when we come to where we started, and then we'll show how we're going to turn the bag. After we've finished sewing the top of the lining to the main body of the bag all the way around, we're going to come down the lining to where we have that opening at near the bottom of the tail. We're going to reach inside, we're going to grab the main bag, and we're going to very slowly pull it through that opening. Working very slowly because we don't want to rip the edges where we've sewn this lining at. Just going to keep working our way through, pulling it out, pulling it out. Now we're going to, here's the outside of the bag. And here's where it's stitched at the top to the lining. Before we push the lining into the main bag, now we're going to have to hand stitch our lining closed. And this is why I made those guide stitching marks with my white thread. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to either take this to the iron and I'm going to press this under nicely, or I'm just going to fold it under and pin it and sew it as we go. So the decision is yours. If nobody's going to see this bag and you don't care how it looks, you can just take it to the machine, pin these together, and you can top stitch right over the top of it like that, very close to the edge. If you're going to sell your bags, or you're going to give them as a gift, or you just like to have everything nice and neat and perfect, then I'm going to recommend that you hand stitch. So I'm going to show you how to hand stitch this with invisible stitch so that you can have it with a nice professional look. I have another tutorial on YouTube showing how to do this invisible stitch, and it's much easier to see because I'm not using black fabric. To try and help show a little bit easier, I'm going to use pink thread to stitch this closed with. Normally I would use matching thread, so I would be using black thread on the black fabric. I'm going to begin by stitching. We're going to start from stitching right to left, and I'm going to have my thread double threaded here, my needle double threaded, and I'm going to have a good size knot at the end of my thread. Don't know if you can see that. I'm going to start by going to the section that's already sewn. So right before the opening begins, I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to place it into that fold right there that's already sewn with the machine, and I'm going to come up in that little fold of the fabric, and I'm going to very slowly pull my thread through because I don't want to tangle my thread into a knot. Okay, so now that my thread is into that fold, I'm going to begin by coming to the edge that is furthest away from me. And I'm going to put the needle in, and I'm going to take just the tiniest little stitch. I'm going to pull the thread up very, very slowly because it's very easy to tangle when it's long. I'm going to pull up. Now that stitch was rather long, so you can see it. If the thread were matching, this wouldn't be such a big deal. You wouldn't see it, it'd blend right in. So now I'm going to come over to the side closest to me, and I'm going to take a little stitch. I'm going to pull that closed. Go to the side opposite. Put the needle in that fold of the fabric. I'm going to take a little stitch. Pull the needle through very slowly. I've got to clip that little piece of white thread there. It's getting in our way. Okay. Now you can see those two pink stitches that I just took. You can barely see them in there. Barely see them. And that's what we want. If those were the same color thread as the fabric, it would be invisible. We would not be able to see it, and that is the goal. So I'm going to come back now, and I'm going to come to the side closest to me, right directly in front of where I took that stitch. I'm going to put the needle into that fold of the fabric, just a little stitch. Pull the needle very slowly so we don't tangle our thread. Pull that tight. Go to the side opposite, again in the fold of the fabric, very little stitch. Pull that through. So we've taken several stitches now, and even though the fabric is a different color, we really can't see them. Can barely see the color of that pink. Barely. So we're going to continue on for the length of this, doing the same, coming to the side closest to me now, taking a little stitch, pulling it through very slowly, going to the opposite side, taking just a little stitch right into that fold. Coming up, pulling it all the way through, pulling it tight. We're going to continue this all the way down until we come to the end. We're going to knot off our thread, and we'll continue to the final step of our mermaid bag. I finished sewing that seam closed using our invisible stitch, and now I'm going to take the lining and I'm going to push it into the main bag. Going to pull my straps up, and we're going to stretch this out, pin it in place, give it a good press at the ironing board to give this a good crease if you like before you pin it in place. So we're going to say we're going to even this out nicely, or we're going to give it a good press at the pressing board with the iron. We're going to pin it. We're going to take it to the machine. This is the very last step. I'm going to start at the side seams. I'm going to put it under the presser foot, 1/4 of an inch, right at the edge of the presser foot, and I'm going to top stitch this, being very careful not to catch these straps. I'm going to top stitch this all the way around the top, and then our bag will be finished. So I'm going to press this, top stitch it, come back, and we'll take a look at the final bag. Okay, our bag is done. We have made the pattern. We learned how to make a lining. We learned how to do invisible stitching. We learned how to do some very basic machine quilting. For a beginner, you have learned quite a few new techniques with this video. I need to make a disclosure though. The pattern is my intellectual property, so please do not sell this pattern made with my design. If you do not want to make your own pattern, I will have it available in my Etsy shop. I will make a link in the information section right above the comments. I will also have some of the finished bags for sale, and they are available to make custom orders. I love you all so much. Blessings to everyone. Happy sewing, and I will see you soon.